On behalf of Johns Hopkins and SAIS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this collaboration between us and the Overseas Press Club. And what I think and I hope, expect, Scott and I have agreed, is will be the first of many collaborations together in bringing together our two communities of scholars and journalists and having these important discussions at a time when it doesn't need any persuading all of you. It's such an important thing to do. And, as we began to think about this and the idea sort of first emerged, it seemed to me that it was really a natural partnership because there are tremendous synergies and similarities between the work of what journalists do and what we do here at SAIS and in universities like Johns Hopkins. The idea that we're both engaged in trying to be rigorous and thoughtful and discovering the facts, empirically based knowledge about what's going on in the world, nonpartisan, basically open to making sure that the full set of ideas and perspectives are aired is something that are values and really in the blood of both professions. And as Scott and I were talking about, in that sense, it's really quite perfect that we're doing this in this space, because as many of you know, this was the museum of the First Amendment, the museum before it became the home for Johns Hopkins here in DC. And it seems like a very fitting and natural thing, and we really honor that tradition by following the footsteps of the museum. So great partnership, a really natural partnership, and we've got an extraordinary group of panelists here, both from the world of journalism and from the world of scholarship, to talk about the issues, about the challenges of studying and understanding about what's going on in China, which obviously is very challenging, as we all know, for many reasons today. And for us at SAIS in particular, the school has had a long history of very distinguished scholars working on the issues of China, both on its domestic and its international policy. And if you look at the roster today and the people on the panel, we're really pleased that the breadth of scholars that we have, not just here at SAIS, but also at the Krieger School and other parts of Gora, other parts of the university. I mean, we have really made a commitment to make this a centerpiece of the work that they're doing. And it's really epitomized by the creation of our new Institute on the United States, China, and the future of global affairs, headed by my colleague, Jessica Weiss, which is a new collaboration that has been created as a focal point for scholars across all of Johns Hopkins campuses, harnessing the breadth of expertise that we have here in the study of China and its pivotal role in the world, and supporting both scholars and practitioners. So supporting research, but also helping foster an informed engagement in the policy community here in DC. And although the Institute is just in its first year of operation, really, it's already had a really remarkable set of activities, of convenings and sponsoring scholarship on trying to get China right, and really to bring an informed and empirically based study to these issues. So it's really a great pleasure for me to have this collaboration here, and particularly to start on this topic. And so I want to thank our colleagues at the Overseas Press Club and invite Scott to come up and say a word.
Good morning and welcome. It's wonderful to be with you. It's wonderful to be in this building, as Jim mentioned. This is my first time, actually, personally, to be back in this building since it was the museum, and it's a special place for journalists. And as I was mentioning to Jim and Jessica, I like what you've done with the place. It's very nice. On behalf of the Overseas Press Club, we are so pleased to be able to partner with Johns Hopkins and SAIS on today's program. Our organization was founded in 1939, and we represent legions of journalists who care deeply about the value of global reporting and who do that work with tremendous courage and often against formidable odds. For these past 8 decades, we have sponsored annual awards that recognize the finest in international reporting. We also provide support for journalists working abroad and develop programs like today's, which focus on a part of the world where reporting is especially difficult and challenging, not only for journalists, but as we know, for scholars as well. So thank you to the dean and everyone at the school for all your work on this program and this partnership. And thank you for joining us. And I'll invite Jessica Weiss to the stage with her panel, first panel. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm Jessica Weiss, the director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs, or ACF, where we seek to add rigor and reason to the public and policy conversations about China. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome such an esteemed panel of both journalists and my fellow colleagues here at SAIS today to talk about some of the challenges of covering China from within. A second panel later this morning will talk about the challenge of covering China and its increasingly global presence. But for now, let me first introduce my fellow panelists. Directly to my right is Li Yuan, reporter for the New York Times and the host of a very well-known podcast, Conversations with Li Yuan, or the Booming Bai podcast. Next, we have Jody Schneider, formerly with Bloomberg and currently the governor and press freedom chair at the Overseas Press Club. Welcome, Jody. It's wonderful to be in partnership with you here today. Next, we have my colleague Ling Chen, the William L. Clayton Chair and Associate Professor of Johns Hopkins University SAIS. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Andy Murtha, the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, Director of the China Studies Program, and the Director of the SAIS China Global Research Center here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So as we gather here today, I think one of the biggest questions when you look at the current media and scholarly ecosystem covering China, I wanted to ask each of you in turn, what do you see as some of the biggest weaknesses? And in short, what are we consistently missing or getting wrong in today's environment? Lee, and why don't we start with you?
Hello? Okay. For me, I think the biggest weakness is there's too much focus on tech, trade, and geopolitics. Those are very important issues, of course, but I think we risk of framing everything through the lens of geopolitics. Like the United States, China is a very big, complex country, and we can't talk about China's tech and manufacturing power without taking into account the economy as a whole and the well-being of its people. That's what I see. I wrote about this in a column maybe in May about two Chinas. There's the hopeful China, what I call the hopeful China, the tech. The world of Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi, and Huawei. Those are really world-class companies. But there's also what I call the gloomy China, the weak consumption, the rising unemployment, and the housing crisis, on and on and on. It's like there's a crisis of confidence for general Chinese if you talk to them. And I just think if we want to tell a China story, we have to take into account of both of them. It's just like, when you talk about the United States, you cannot just talk about how powerful the Silicon Valley is. And then without talking about all the other issues this country has. And so that's what I think I would like to see. We talk about both sides and not just talk about, China is winning. The DeepSeek is so wonderful. Look at all the robots China have. Look at the high-speed railways, and all of those are true. But we have to look behind a lot of things behind that. So, and that's what I think. There's what I feel from my years of covering China, I see a tendency of swing from one side to the other, from ignoring, demonizing China, to now I kind of feel like a glorifying China. So, it's from like underestimation to overestimation. I just feel like we need to find some kind of like a nuance or the middle ground. Like that's what I feel like we can give give the readers, give our audience a more truthful portrayal of China. I can keep talking about this because I have so much, so much I can vent about, like from my years of covering China, my frustration of reading all the stories. You know, I film almost every day. I was like, what? They know this? But at the same time, of course, there have been always like wonderful China coverage. I don't want to say like I'm I'm not happy about most of them, but I really say at this moment, especially in the past 7-8 months since the DeepSeek moment, I saw a swing to the other side.
A way to get us started. Thank you. And hopefully we'll dive into some more of those questions in a bit. Jody, what about you?
Thank you, and thank you for including me in this panel. I think from my perspective as a press freedom advocate and somebody who's cared about this my whole career, that the concern now is not just the concern we've had with China in terms of press freedom and state control of the media, but there are fewer and fewer journalists from outside who are being allowed to work in China. First of all, when you look at the numbers, the Press Freedom Index from Reporters Without Borders, China's 178 out of 180, only Eritrea and North Korea or worse. And we've also seen Hong Kong, where I was and many of us were, where it was there was a fair bit of press freedom. And as recently as 2019, before the protests, Hong Kong had scored in the 70s on that list. They are now much lower on that list. So there's that state control, and when we talk about state control of the media, we don't just mean the state, the media that is owned and run by the state, but they control obviously the visas of journalists going into China, and those have not been granted nearly as freely, and they were always tight. But in recent years, tighter and tighter, and journalists have gotten kicked out of the country. And China controls what journalists do when they are in the country. They are very surveilled. They're watched very closely who they talk to. And that is happening more and more in Hong Kong as well. It's hard to get people to talk to you. So journalists operating there and media publications operating both in China and in Hong Kong are really having to be really creative about ways just to do their work, to do their basic work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody. Lynn, can I turn to you for the perspective of one scholar? And we'll hear also from Andy as well on this. What do you see as some of the biggest weaknesses in our coverage of China?
Thanks, and my pleasure to be here. So for me, from a scholar perspective, I think the biggest weakness is that we lack a on-the-ground perspective to understand why certain actors behave in certain way and what their intentions are. And as a result, we tend to rely too much on formal leaders' speech, formal documents to interpret the intentions and results, which affects both our work quality and the way in which we interact with each other. Some examples in my field are, let me try to think of examples. So, for example, all the success or increase in China's industrial manufacturing are typically interpreted as state subsidies to state-owned firms as a way to overtake the United States. As opposed to, China is having this overcapacity because the real estate bubbles break and so, right? And there's more story behind that. Most of the private firms in China were seen as the tools for China's party state as opposed to real private firms. The recent study of over-centralization under the Xi Jinping government, because we have this lack of access problem, are overly relying on documents at the policy documents at the central and the local level, as documents as they printed out as text, rather than what exactly bureaucrats and businesses were doing on the ground. Hence, they cannot explain why in some places they're doing so well, they're actively developing AI, semiconductor, and extra, and in some other areas, they're simply paralyzed. because of that, we want to call for more, just echoing this panel, that we want to call for more nuanced understanding of China. And I believe that this is not only, but having a perspective from within is not only important to understand China from within, it's also important to understand China's foreign policy, because all the foreign policy has their domestic politics, have their domestic messages. I think I'll stop.
Really important set of points, Ling, thank you. We've all voiced a number of complaints here, and I wanted to also, open space for how have we overcome some of these challenges. And Andy, I know you've led a really important project on studying China in the absence of access. So what are some of the best practices that you've identified for, nonetheless trying to understand China, even given the hurdles that we've been talking?
So if I can, but first of all, Jessica, thanks for inviting me to this panel, and I'd like to come back around to that if I could. But I wanted to, I wanted to add to this particular discussion as well. But I want to start by acknowledging the fact that long before on-the-ground scholarship in China, at least US scholarship, became a thing, what we learned most was from journalists. So, when I was first learning about China way back when, people whose work I read over and over again, people like Stanley Carnow, Bob Butterfield, Roger Garside. So I would just want to echo what Jim was saying. There's real synergy of interests here. In talking about the problems, before I talk about or mention kind of what I'm trying to do in my neck of the woods, is I think first of all, there's an arm's length nature of research that is problematic for a number of reasons. Part of this, I think, is due to risk aversion. Some of it's reasonable, some of it less reasonable. I remember those of us who are in positions of some security, which is in the case of say tenured faculty, we were browbeaten by not browbeaten exactly, but by about not recognizing our position of responsibility, of taking the lead when other groups of folks within the academy are at some vulnerability. I remember when first time I went back to China after COVID, I remember sitting around with some colleagues who were living and working in Hong Kong. And they were taking bets on how many hours I'd been detained when I crossed the border. And so I built in an extra 5 hours just in case. And so I ended up sitting at the Shenzhen airport for 5 extra hours because nothing happened. So there is this risk aversion there. The other thing I think, and Ling touched upon this with documents, is that we're getting increasingly reliant on more easily available data. And as a result, it biases and distorts what we know by us really not being able to go into what we don't know. And so that's something, I mean, it's been a perennial problem, but it's just gotten worse. So I think at this point, it's still a difference of degree, not in kind, but I think we're not too far away from that happening. Third thing is that I think for those of us in academia, there is a shift more towards, especially for younger colleagues, a shift towards the intellectual center of our disciplines, which do not necessarily reward in-country expertise. And so that becomes a kind of a vicious circle. And then I wanted to come back and just agree wholeheartedly with Li Yuan's point about being more than one China. I think the focus on China, and this is a through line for I think a lot of what I'm going to say today, is that we focus on China as a unitary state, which technically it is. But in doing so, we ignore the vast majority of what's going on in China, and frankly, the vast majority of things that keep Xi Jinping awake at night. When we think about things in geopolitics, in international terms, we do not think about it in terms of China as an extraordinarily complex state. One of the things, and Jessica very kindly mentioned, one of the things that I've been trying to do with scholars, all of us are doing our little bit to try to mitigate these problems. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is how do we how do we make the most out of such a challenging situation that we find ourselves in? And so, one of the things that I've been looking at with other scholars is kind of bringing in people who studied China in the late 60s, 70s, the so-called Pekingologists, to help train those of us who didn't need Pekingology because we took access to China for granted. And so that might help mitigate some of the things that Ling was talking about, not only in terms of just having the documents, but how to actually make sense of them and go through them and read between the lines and make sense of the repetition of silences, Simon Lee has put it. I'm currently working on a second version of that, which is studying China from outside of China. And that's what a lot of people are doing today. There's lots of other ways of approaching this. But I think one of the things that we really, that these questions raise is, okay, so given the situation, how do we actually study China given the hand we've been dealt?
Sandy, and I wanted to pull out a couple of threads here about what we don't know. And we've talked about some of the challenges of knowing, but I want to put a finer point on what are some of the things where you think that we are perhaps collectively kind of overly confident in some of our assertions that might actually require a bit more humility as one of the values that underpins the work that we do here at ACF, not only rigor, but also humility, knowing the limits of what we know so that we and others can go forth and try to understand it better. I don't know if Jody, you or Lee want to speak a little bit to that question of, what do we not know if we don't go to China? If we can't be on the ground, what are the things where we should be a little cautious in drawing some conclusions?
Well, I think this speaks to the need to have more people on the ground in China, more journalists, more academics, as well as more Chinese academics and journalists in the US, which is going to be a problem here if this proposal from the Department of Homeland Security goes through, which would limit foreign journalists on I visas to 8 months without a necessary automatic renewal. So this is a problem on this side, getting Chinese journalists here, because of course the best journalism is done when you are, and we found this, our OPC awards winners go to these places. They get sources there. They see things that you're not going to see. And in China, this is particularly important because of course the government wants to control what you see. You go on a so-called junket that they've rearranged or they've arranged, it's not going to tell you what you need to know. So I think that's what we don't know is going to be greater if we're not there. It's that simple. And both the same for Chinese journalists reporting on the US, trying to report fairly on the US. Thank you.
Recently, a young Chinese told me something. I thought that was really poetic. And she said, China is a country that looks really good from drones. From drones, and then you look down because they are like the highways, the bridges. China just built the world's tallest, highest bridge in Guizhou. I saw a lot of US media cover that. It's a great picture, great image. And then, also the skyscrapers, the high-speed trains, and all those things, it's really looks amazing. For me personally, last time I was in China was the Chinese New Year of 2020. And we all know that Wuhan was locked down. Then I rushed back to Hong Kong. And then I was kicked out of Hong Kong in 2021, and I haven't been back to China. I've been covering China from outside China. And so I'm always worried I will lose the real touch, the real feelings of China. I worry about it all the time. The smell, the taste, the vibe, you can't. It's very hard to get that when you are covering something from afar. I remember in 2021, I wrote a column about the rise of Chinese domestic brands that were competing with multinational brands like Starbucks, like P&G or whatever, like Nike. Then there was a one ice cream brand, 钟雪糕. People like young people like they really loved it. They talk about it all the time. I just couldn't get hold of that ice cream. I couldn't taste it. I just didn't know it was really good. It was just like a vibe, right? A hype. And so that was something you could never tell. Of course, now I'm sure if I look really hard, I might be able to find something here in the US, but it was during the pandemic. So I also missed the dinner discussions in Beijing and Hong Kong, and visiting places in China. For example, I asked my friends when they were going to visit Xiong'an, if you know that city. It's a pet project of Xi Jinping, basically a city built on Xi Jinping's vision. When my friends, I heard some friends were going there, asked them to videotape, take a lot of photos and videotape, and then just kind of, I wanted to get some feel of it. There are a lot of frustrations about that. So it's also, to echo Jody's points, it's I'm really worried about we don't have enough people on the ground in China, and we do have journalists. While we do have journalists in China, they are surveilled, they are threatened constantly, and it is also hard for them to go out to write, to cover China, and the Chinese people are intimidated all the time, and also by the authorities, and it's almost like a crime speaking to the foreign media, because you're like DDoS, you hand over the bad materials to hostile foreign media. That's what the Fang Fang episode during the Wuhan lockdown came from. It's like, you should not talk bad about China, otherwise you're hurting your motherland, and then you're helping the house of. Anyway, it's just very difficult for journalists like me who are covering China from afar, but it's also very difficult for journalists inside China to cover China. So there are a lot of challenges.
Can I ask a follow-up, which is that, with shrinking bureaus and staffing inside China, how have outlets like Bloomberg and the New York Times been kind of rethinking their China coverage? What do you see as some of the implications of this shift for the types of stories that are chosen, sourcing and verification? Would either of you like to comment?
To be honest, I'm not, I'm a columnist. I work from home almost all the time. I don't really, I stay up around midnight every day. So I don't really I don't even go to the New York office, our headquarters. We have two correspondents in China, Vivian Wang and Case Bradshaw, and it's a such huge country for the two of them just to travel to places. Case covered a lot about trade, geopolitics, and Vivian, I just love Vivian Wang's stories. If you have time, I highly recommend you read her stories, about this guy who were in Guizhou, in rural Guizhou, I believe it was Guizhou, and who refused, who did not want his house to be torn down by the government. Then he just kept building up and built like a nine-floor building. It was like crazy story. It's a really show like the spirit of Chinese people. And also she just wrote another story the other day about the last mile of food delivery. How do you deliver food to 70th floor in Shenzhen? And when the elevator wait is like 30 minutes. And so it was like, so great. I love Vivian's coverage, and those are like, of course, when we had 8 correspondents in China before 2020, so many of us could go out and write stories. Some of us covered more arts, demographics. I covered tech. They're like just you have more spectrum to write about things. Now it's like, I feel like the two of them, they work so hard. They have to cover from so many aspects. And it's such huge country, 1.4 billion people. I just hope, to echo Jody's point, I think we need more business.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the New York Times and Bloomberg and Reuters and the European publications who do have, bureaus and presence in China are doing what they can. I think that their standards are being upheld, their independent journalist standards. They work very hard on accuracy and fairness and an independent voice. I don't think they, say, okay, we have to, lower our standards. I haven't seen any of that in the coverage. I think they're doing what they can, but it's hard. I mean, the New York Times is covering, China and Hong Kong from Seoul now. That's where the bureau is. And I think that, a lot of publications have moved people to Singapore from Hong Kong. So it makes it harder. I do think, in a bright spot, if you will, there is more independent journalism of China through places like Substack. Bill Bishop's Sinoism is one of the most popular, most read things, most subscribed things to on Substack. You are seeing that. You are seeing some independent publications against all odds crop up, somewhat in the mainland, but in Hong Kong, where many have been closed down. Others are popping up. So I do think there is a spirit there to try to cover as much as journalists can, but again, it's tough. And for instance, economic data, a lot of publications, and I know Bloomberg and Reuters, have run their own data and in some cases to verify, to try to be as accurate as they can about the economic picture in China, not just relying on what the state is telling them. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great. Turning to the scholarly perspective, I know that the space for journals has become very constricted, and there are certainly concerns and challenges on the expert side as well. But both of you, Andy and Ling, spoke about the importance of field work. And so I'm, even if you didn't get stopped at the border, nonetheless, how has the experience of doing field work changed over the last decade or so? If you were, making the case that we should continue to still do it, what could you, to put a fine point on it, what is the value of doing this kind of on-the-ground research, and what specific insights do you think in your own research you couldn't have gotten any other way?
Sure, if I can, thank you. So losing access or having constricted access, means a lot of things, at least for me and the people that I'm working with and training and so on. So I think the first thing is that we lose kind of the gray areas of data collection. One of the things, like in China, if you do everything the way you're supposed to do it, nothing ever gets done. So everything is always a little bit of a just a kind of massaging of opportunities and finding ways to be lucky. But these kinds of happy accidents don't happen if you're not there. So one of the articles that I'm most proud of on centralization in China, that came just somebody, it was actually interviewing somebody from Nike in Shanghai, and he mentioned that. And that, just kind of threw it out there, like, of course you know about this, right? And of course I didn't know about this. And it became a research agenda just by virtue of being, having this kind of a happy accident. For people who do archival stuff, the digitalization of everything means that you can't find that misplaced kind of document or set of documents in the stacks that eventually, that ultimately, give you much more information than anything else. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is, the increasing anxiety about harming interlocutors in China. Sheena Greitens and Rory Truex wrote a piece, was published in the China Quarterly in 2020 called Repressive Experiences Among China Scholars. And one of the big findings there is that on the one hand, scholars do not generally self-censor, but when they do so not out of fear of not getting future access, but rather because they're afraid of compromising the people who provide them with the data. So that's really, really important. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this kind of falls on the shoulder of, or a lot of the people who are victimized by this are junior scholars. I wanted to also Leon has been really, really good at articulating things better than I might have. But what I'd like to do is just kind of riff on one of the things that she was saying about vibes, about smells, tastes, things like that. This is really, really important to just get a feel for the place, not only to help test your own research, but also for pedagogical reasons. Particularly, and you might get this later, with students increasingly feel uncomfortable about actually going to China. It means it puts more of a burden, which I'm happy to take on, to bring more of everyday China into the classroom. Leo had mentioned vibes. I think vibes are really, really important, but I think another way of thinking about those is as instincts. My students have heard me say this a zillion times, but at the best moments, you might have 20 or 30% of the data that you need. And so you have to make inferences. You have to close these gaps of knowledge. And the best resource you have are your instincts. And those instincts are based on what you're constantly taking in from spending time on the ground in China. And we lose that. And sometimes we not even know what's going on. I'll just give one example. I remember I returned from my honeymoon in Thailand. My new wife and I were going through Guangdong, and we saw all of these photos of Deng Xiaoping just everywhere. And we were wondering, well, what's going on? Of course, that was February of 1992. And I was based in Shanghai at the time, and I could feel a palpable, almost tangible change week by week as we moved from February 1992 to October of 1992 to the 14th Party Congress. And essentially with Deng Xiaoping's reform agenda being put back on track. And you could sense the excitement bubbling just below the surface. Cautious excitement, but nonetheless, it was a very, very different feel from a year before that. And unless you were on the ground in China, first of all, you didn't know if it was happening in real time, even if you didn't know what it was. But the other thing is that you can really speak about the importance of politics at the at street level by experiencing that yourself. So we lose all of that.
Ling, did you want to add anything?
Let me just add a couple of points from my personal perspective as a researcher and how I see the broader field. When I was doing research for my first book project, and in general, I started going to China field a lot more, starting 2008, and broadly speaking, 2010, 2011-ish, I was able to access a lot of and conduct a lot of interviews, hundreds of them. And at the time, the picture was so different that I would go to banquets with local bureaucrats and drink with them, get their perspective. And this is partly how you formulate your hypothesis for your theory, not necessarily in a formal one-on-one interview, but that affects your perspective, your insights. And also I could interview a lot of enterprises such as Huawei, such as ZTE. At the time, most people have not heard of them yet. So they, it's like I took for granted these opportunities to conduct interviews. But starting in 2015-ish, I started to experience difficulties that whenever I go to the field, for example, trying to interview about technology innovation of enterprises, development, certain development of enterprise, or how local governments help them, the access was not great, and I was without naming names, I was referred to some of the PDF documents on their official website. They said, well, what we're gonna tell you, well, exactly verbatim repeating of like, I would just read from this PDF document, maybe you can just go to download by yourself, right? So that is a big change compared to before that period. Of course, increasingly we come to a time that if you want to interview Huawei, well, everyone has heard of Huawei by now, right? So that becomes when an enterprise raises up to that level and there are certain sensitivities involved, it's very hard to get access. So there's a general broader field, general broader trend in our field for our pipeline scholars that this lack of access problem is causing them to focus more on survey experiments or online surveys, public opinions, topics related to public opinions, instead of, for example, examining what's the actual impacts of trade war, right? They're examining what are the public opinions about trade war. There is general trend because of lack of access to interview to focus more on observational quantitative studies, survey experiments, machine learning, and or things that happened decades ago. Because things happened decades ago, you have more well-developed secondary resources instead of contemporary period where you still have to develop the first-hand experience. So that affects both our methods and the topic as well. Now, one thing I noticed, which originally could be a good trend, is in the pipeline, China experts, there are more and more scholars that are from mainland China. That is, more and more they are Chinese students coming to the States and get their PhDs and eventually become professors. But the most unfortunate thing I think is, well, originally they were equipped with the language tools and everything to access China, but because of this limitation and constraint, also because of the trend of our own discipline, right? As Andy mentioned, we're not seeing a lot of this kind of works. That is one of the things that is really one of the things that we could have done better than that we have not. I would just stop here. I think Andy has.
Thanks. I just had a two-finger on, and Ling raised a number of excellent points as usual. But I wanted to, she reminded me of one that I hadn't thought of, but that I think is also really, really important in answering this question. And that is, when you've got a student who is on the eve of going into the field and doing their research, they write a prospectus, the committee signs off on it, and it's basically a contract between the student and their committee that they're going to do X, Y, and Z. And the expectation among the committee is that there's probably going to be a huge, or at least a palpable change in what they actually end up doing. Because usually when you get into the field, you realize you're asking the wrong questions, or you're looking at things the wrong way, or you haven't taken into account something that's actually driving what you're looking at. When I was in the field, my causal arrows reversed themselves. So the problem here, of course, is that if you're taking that component out of that fieldwork component out of serious research, you're far more likely to come up with something that is inaccurate and something that's based on existing priors or biases or expectations. And so in a sense, we're I don't want to come off too strongly, but we end up kind of deluding ourselves as to what is actually going on there.
That's such an important point, Andy, that we find what we're looking for unless you're sometimes confronted with, oh, things aren't actually quite the way you thought. It's much harder to revise one's intuitions. And I think this is true about using documents and speeches too. From my experience, even this past summer going to China, oftentimes it's really, I found it very helpful to understand how folks inside China were interpreting the same data or speeches that we can have access to, because it colors what you take away from from those same documents. Okay, so we have time for, I think, a last round before we turn to your questions from the audience. So for each of you, if you could recommend one change in either institutional policies or in newsroom priorities or in scholarly training that would most improve the global conversation about China, what would it be? First, anybody want to start? Otherwise, we can go down the line. Lee, would you like to begin?
I think Lin touch upon this already, you know. I hope media organization could hire more Chinese China-born reporters to cover China. It's because I'm from that background. It's just very important to be able to read, to interact with source material, with people. It's just more natural, especially in this period that Chinese people are so scared of speaking to journalists, and it's just like one less barrier it's I don't know how people are going to interpret how I say this, but it just make people at ease, easier to make people at ease, and also it's the background. You know, even for me, like my generation and like the younger generation of Chinese, like the knowledge of where China came from is already, you know, I found like many young Chinese, they don't really know what they don't remember what happened in China at that time, even like 10, 15 years ago, when I was covering China tech. And what happened then, it's like, I have to remind them, like when I have conversations with them, I have to remind them, this has happened before. And this had, you know, this is where things, it's quite difficult for Chinese who grew up in that environment to remember, to understand everything. It's just like, I think language is very, very important. It's to be able to read all the documents. I'm not saying like, you know, people like Jessica or Andy, it's like there are many people who speak like perfect Chinese who can do it, but I just think we need more China-born journalists to cover China. Of course, there are a lot of barriers. It's like intimidation from the government, you know, like you have family members there and all those things. It's very tough, but I really see news organizations benefiting from that.
I would like to say to both the US and China's governments to let the journalists in. Do not use visas as a weapon against journalism, against getting to know these countries, getting to report on them. I think that in the long run, even though they are worried about their image and how they be portrayed, I think in the long run it does the government's good as well to have accurate, fair, balanced journalism out there from both sides. So we as the OPC and other journalism organizations have very much come out against this visa proposal, and the Chinese government actually has come out against it as well. They don't, they in the back and forth with the U.S. government over visas. But I think just letting journalists into these countries, looking at their visas the way they used to, obviously appropriately evaluating their ability, and their news organizations backing of them, but let them in. Thank you.
Well, I have one relatively limited change proposed because I think in the short run, large scale of scholarly exchange between US and China may be difficult. But one limited change I want to propose is to require or recommend students read news and articles published in both US and China and compare the reports on the same matter. There are plenty of examples of how do we understand China's parade from abroad and from domestically? How do we understand that China's T visa and what we just opened up a K visa, right? So all these things, on the same matter, it's important to compare the foreign and domestic perspective. And some people may say, well, this required language training to understand Chinese. If learning Chinese is not plausible in the short term for some of the students, they can simply rely on AI translation, right? AI gets better and better nowadays anyway. So I think even though the translation would not be exactly accurate, it still helps with the matter. And I think this change is doable.
Thank you. I guess if there was just one thing, it would be a pretty big thing. It's a kind of a normative change. But I think we need to embrace the notion that we're always better off with more knowledge than with less. And that's whether we see China as a misunderstood ally or as a direct existential threat. In either case, in knowledge generation, I think we should consider mitigating risk ex post more than on the overwhelming tendency to do it ex ante. When it comes to scholars, journalists, and others who genuinely engage with China in these times, I think what we should do is verify or trust. That would be my suggestion.
Fantastic. Thank you all for those opening remarks. Now we'll turn to the audience for your questions. Please, if you can, there's a microphone, yes, in the middle. Oh no, passing mics. Okay. So here I saw firsthand. User, would you please briefly identify yourself? Yes, briefly identify yourself. And then direct your question to whoever you like.
Thank you. So my name is Jordan Lei, fourth year PhD at SAIS and someone who take pride of doing fieldwork in China. So I have two questions. First one is, how do you address the lack of institutional support for both academia and I guess journalists as well from the American side, and the lack of commitment to send students or researchers or journalists to China? And second is one question that I was confronted when demonstrating my research to people more in the policy world about local China or more grassroots China. Their first reaction is, why do we care? So how do we address this question of generating knowledge about, let's say, government policy making at a rural Chinese town to the greater audience and tell them it is really important? Thank you.
Take that.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Let me address your second question, which is, I think, very challenging question. Because nowadays, the focus on China, to the extent that you're doing research, is the general audience interest is less and less on what happened in this Chinese village. How do I understand the normal people's life in this rural China village? It's more about, to the extent matter, how does it matter for my taste or for the US audience interest? And again, that a lot of folks are on the, what Lee has mentioned, the geopolitical geopolitical reasoning or geopolitical content. So I acknowledge that I do not have perfect solution about on the question you raised, but perhaps when you are doing a research, let's see, in this China village or China locality, what important is like what are the theoretical implications that you can derive from that? And that may be from a very small town or village, probably there can generate a bigger theoretical implication and message that you then you can talk to the broader audience and to make them interested. I don't know if this helps at all. And
Thanks, Ling. So just on the lack of institutional support on the US side, I mean, what I would say is that things are so much in churn right now that it's very difficult. We haven't reached a point where we can kind of take stock and see where we are and what we can do, and how we can kind of map up to the Chinese side. There's all sorts of kind of long-standing institutional challenges, but right now we're really in the epicenter of something that is unprecedented, and it unfortunately the timing couldn't be worse for students who want to do research on the field in the field in China. So I mean, my generic answer to that would be to kind of stay within the bounds of what we are required to do, but to be innovative and entrepreneurial kind of within those bounds. To answer the second question, I'll take a different tack from what Ling just did, and think about. I can just think of an example that I think could kind of push back on that "why should I care" question. So China and Ghana in the mid-aughts came to diplomatic blows following riots where people were killed in Ghana. This resulted from the fact that one county in China, in Guangxi province or the Guangxi Zhuang autonomous region, started sending its people to Ghana to undertake what was called galamsey, which is the illegal mining for gold, using things like mercury and kind of undercutting the local Ghanaian gold economy. This is something that was not one of Beijing's foreign policy initiatives. It was something that was generated at the county level. And nonetheless, it put Beijing's relations with Ghana onto a really kind of relatively insecure footing. So domestic politics in China increasingly matter. And I think that's another thing that we should, as a China comparativist, I look at domestic politics, and so international relations have largely been kind of off limits for me. As China extends internationally, and as as it has under Xi Jinping, all of a sudden the pathologies that we've learned about Chinese domestic politics also get exported abroad. And therefore, it's really important for us, particularly in this time, I think, to understand what's going on domestically.
Great, thanks so much. We have another question, way in the back, the lady here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Laurel Schwartz. I was recently a school principal at a Canadian Chinese school in Beijing. And now that Li Yuan mentioned, the challenge of not being in China on the ground, and I can't imagine what it's like to not be able to go to your own home. But in addition to Bill Bishop and Vivian Wong and Keith Bradshaw, who do you follow to find out what's going on, either in English or in Chinese? What recommendations can you give us?
You can follow my podcast. Yeah, I do this Chinese podcast. It's approved by. It's my personal project, approved by the New York Times. I talk to mostly Chinese people on a weekly basis, and we chat about basically everything. It's in Chinese, but we also have transcripts for every episode. And as Lynn mentioned, I found Google Translate is pretty good. And I most of the time I read Chinese sources. To be honest, I spend a lot of time on Chinese social media, which is not very healthy. But you have to, right? As a journalist, that's that's part of the job. I read Xiaohongshu, the Red Note, Weibo, WeChat, and it's Bilibili. I just do a lot of things, and I also I think Substack has become pretty good. There are, if you are talking about English sources, Bill Bishop, that's very good, and also I can't remember the name, Signification. They basically write about what's in people's daily every day, right? It's there are also some Chinese, young Chinese. They are very good. I just talked to this young writer, April Wang, who used to work in Silicon Valley, and now she writes about technology. basically full-time, and it's called, her newsletter is called Concurrent on Substack, and it's like she went to China and then talked to Chinese AI developers, and she just wrote very long pieces with some kind of like a point of view from Silicon Valley. And it's very relatable for American audience. And I can't remember all the names. There's also another newsletter, young Chinese writer who writes about Chinese pop culture. I thought it's really amazing. You know, there are so many young Chinese, they are not like a trained journalists, but they are just very interested in sharing their perspectives. And I thought, yeah, I like those.
Thank you. We have here in the front, sir.
Thank you. My name is Irv Chapman. I'm a longtime member of the Overseas Press Club. I believe one reminded me of my own analogous experience in the old Soviet Union, where journalists were under severe pressure, but also the regime lied through the teeth day in and day out. So I'd like to ask, to what extent we know what the Chinese regime did with regard to information about the COVID pandemic when it started. To what extent can you rely at all, if at all, on the official statements and statistics of the Chinese government? And to what extent are they outright lies? Oh, and point of order, would you please put the microphone as close as a rock star, because you're also politely soft-spoken.
I'd like to just address Herb's question from one perspective, and I'm sure others will have others, is that the data it's an issue. And this is partly why journalists in this country have stood up for the government continuing to allow things like independent data on jobs reports, for instance. And I know news organizations, including Bloomberg, including the New York Times, including Reuters, run models on economic data based on not only the data they're getting, but doing their own reporting as well. So it is an issue. It's certainly an issue. Andy?
I just want to say one thing. One of the interesting things about Xi Jinping in particular is that if you look back on his particularly his kind of available speeches, if you go down to like the third or fourth paragraph, you know, he pretty much announces kind of what's going to happen. I think we also have to expand our imagination to imagine kind of what he's likely to do, and how that, you know, how it differs from, you know, what's come immediately ahead of him. So I don't tend to trust official statistics, or, you know, I'm not a Pekingologist. So, you know, I'm maybe speaking a little bit out of school here, but one of the things that she has done, if you could get through all that rhetoric, is kind of announce things fairly accurately, ex ante.
Way in the back, I see somebody.
Yes, hello, my name is Prab. So I'm curious to ask you, one of the things that Mrs. Chen described was on the ground. So I'm wondering, considering the technology we have over 8,000 satellites, you know, and we can use a lot. China has, I think, about 3,000 something. So why not discuss about using other forms of technologies, GIS maps, or satellites, to actually find ways, innovative ways to see what's going on, what's the news out there. Why not discuss something on the AI level as well? Why just on the ground? Like, why not other ways? Because we are going to a new phase of world. I would like to hear a perspective on that.
Thank you, and let's take a couple of different questions because we are nearing the end of the session. So up here in front, you've been so patient as we wait for the mic to come up.
Chris McRae. I'm a statistician, but my father worked at The Economist for 40 years. My father taught me that going to go and do a global survey in someone else's country, what's best is to find someone who's trusted already inside that country and to follow their leads and to be positive about the things you're trying to research. So I was in Beijing 3 times between 2015 and 2019. Romano Prodi helped me once. It helped you because he still consults, I think, for Nanjing. Ying Lowry, who was Alibaba's biographer, was there at Tsinghua University, also the sportsman scholars. So if you find someone who's trusted and follow their leads, I think it is still possible to actually, find out what's working on the ground and if it really is working. And that's what interests me with engineering or health, improving it by finding out something someone's talking about, but then going and seeing it's really replicating in communities.
So, any last questions before we turn it to the panel? Yes. In the white.
Hi, so my name is Kaya, and I am a research assistant with a professor who's doing research on Chinese infrastructure in Africa. And we're also designing like a field trip to China to study Chinese infrastructure next summer. And I just want to ask if we got this opportunity and what advice you would give to educators and students during the field trip like experience, like what kind of things should they pay attention to and focus on so that they can get a better understanding of what's really going on in like China's political economy and society and culture. Thank you.
One last question here, and then we'll give each of you a minute.
Hi, I'm Pete Kobus. I'm a former, well, technically current global affairs editor with Voice of America, former Moscow bureau chief. 2 quick questions. I don't know that I've ever trusted USAGM's numbers on our audience size in China, but I'm wondering if since VOA has been shut down, if its absence has been felt on the ground. I'm also editing a memoir for an ethnic Uyghur who's based here in the Washington area. He has this argument that, totally different topic here, that the Taiwan Straits issue is all a smokescreen to distract international attention from repression of the Uyghurs. And I'm wondering if there's, any veracity to that theory. Thank you.
All right, so we have a range of questions. You all have a minute each to say whatever you'd like, either to address the questions or a key takeaway you'd like to leave the audience with.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about the satellite. It's satellite images and AI, New York Times and also many other news organizations have been using satellite images. Remember, there was, I can't remember the news organization, there was a Pulitzer Prize for satellite, based on satellite images of the Uyghur concentration camps, and that was amazing work. And also at the times we have the visual investigation team, and they do a lot of visual investigations. But the problem with, we cannot just report on China based on images from high up, like thousands of miles away, right? And I talk about like China is a country that looks really good from drones, right? You know, behind all the high-speed railways, there's a lot of deaths, overcapacity, it's like a lot of things. And also how whether people, ordinary Chinese, are benefiting from this, and what are the lessons we can learn there. It's just, it's not something, we need those stories, we need those coverages, but that coverage alone cannot be all. And also just one sentence about the VOA, the absence of VOA. I wrote about that, and I did 3 episodes about VOA being shut down and how it impacts Chinese. And I interviewed people from 70s to 20s, and it's the impact of VOA on generations of Chinese. And I feel that it's really, really a big loss. for the Chinese community inside China and outside China, and we need institutional news outlets to cover China, and yeah, that's what I'm.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that about VOA and the loss, losing those voices, and that there were voices. I think has been, I think we're only going to know how much in coming months and years, but it's a huge loss. Secondly, on satellites and AI, good question, but again, they are tools. And as journalists, they are tools. They will not replace journalists. And we will use them as tools, but I think that, again, getting journalists on the ground, getting journalists who know and can source, and also getting sources to talk to us again. They're not going to talk to the robots. They're not going to talk to the satellites. Thank you.
Okay, let me first briefly reply to the AI satellite question and start on, let me try to be positive first, that we have invented a lot of machine learning, amazing machine learning tools that can read tens of thousands of millions of documents much faster than human beings. We also have the GIS AI satellite technology that can draw amazing maps to see how things distributed. But still, the human side, why human side is important is because, for example, right now, China is opening up for K visa. You cannot understand why Chinese citizens are rejecting this idea. It seems to be a really good idea, right? Why Chinese citizens are rejecting this idea? If you try to answer this question through satellite, you cannot do that. And plus, because of data security has become so important in China recently, the access of satellite is limited to whenever you get to actually look at a map, you're like, why this ground, this particular place is blocked out? It's because that's very important areas that you cannot reach by your or those maps and satellite technology. And also to stop on a more positive ground, I think the question about what do we do for our field, what topic we study for field work, it is not as gloomy as we thought, because as Andy mentioned, that the global footprints has reached a lot, every corner of China almost. Perhaps you can always find an interesting topic that's always connecting the local with the global, and I would have a hard time to think somewhere of a locality in China that is absolutely out of touch with the global context nowadays. So yeah, I'll stop here.
That's a great primer for the next panel, but before we take our break, Andy, last thought.
So for my 1 minute, I can't speak about what the closure of BOA has done in China. What I can say is offer my immense gratitude, because when I was in China during Tiananmen in Chengdu, it was due to BOA that I knew what was going on. So it's a very, very important resource. Regarding the Uyghur, linking the Uyghur and the Taiwan issue, I think it sounds to me like one way of interpreting that is that there might be an attachment of too much intentionality to linking the two. I think very often when we look at what happens in China, and this is the Chinese when they look at what happens in the US, they've been doing this for a very long time, is that we attach intentionality to things that are either coincidental or otherwise kind of fall together. I think we have to, it would help us to at least think about if such an activity was unintentional, how and why did it happen? I'm not going to add to anything that's already been said about the satellites and GIS, but it does seem to me to be a little bit more useful in scholarship than in journalism for the reasons already stated. And then finally, in terms of what to do in the field, I would get off of any social media. I put your phone away, except to take photographs. And what I would do is, because of your jet lag, you're going to get up very early in the morning, go out on the street and just walk around. Take in as much as you can. Be a sponge. You might not even know what it is that you're taking in, but you will once you get back.
Please join me in thanking our first panel.
Okay, thank you for coming in, for staying for the second panel. We want to build on some of the commentary and analysis we heard earlier this morning. And so I'll start off by asking each of our panelists who do work on very different subjects, both inside and outside of China, to give us a sense of how the reporting and research that they've been doing on their respective topics has changed over the last, say, 5 years. I think we can all agree that reporting and research in China and China's role in the world was very different before 2020, and that since 2020, roughly in line with both the greater tensions in geopolitics between the U.S. and China, as well as the pandemic, that things changed dramatically for both journalists and scholars. So I'd like to start with Jim Moretti on the end there from the Wall Street Journal, who I think very much experienced personally China's much harder line against journalists starting in the pandemic era, their own pandemic era, and then we can move onward to Margaret, Jeremy, and Sean, and they can talk about the changes in their respective research techniques and difficulties since then.
Thanks, Ed, and happy to be here. I mean, it's an easy, this is almost softball question for me because how things have changed in the past several years. In early 2020, we started to hear about some kind of bug in Wuhan, and I had a chance to go down to Wuhan and see basically the government trying to keep something quiet. It was really unclear what it was they were trying to keep quiet, but we could look inside doors in hospitals and see when they would funnily, I mean, they would get their food deliveries and they're all wearing hazmat suits inside, and then they would close the door. So we knew there was something going on, and people were really afraid and nervous, and it was like amazing insight on the ground reporting that we could do. And again, we didn't even know what it was in January 2020. It was, what was going on. But by March 2020, I was told by the Chinese government that I was expelled. I had lived in Shanghai for 18 years. I had reported from there for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones for the entire time, and had previously been in Hong Kong. So a good, more than 20 years worth of my life was suddenly upended, and I had to. I could have gone pretty much anywhere, but I decided to go to New York City, and there I continued to report about China. I've had to, in many ways, reinvent myself because I can't do any of that on the ground. Fire picking, looking around, and we have to rely a lot more on Xinhua News Agency and our own sort of understanding of how the country might work, how it is working, what it is that maybe they're not saying in the way that they report development. And I mean, just, in a big picture, I think we're also looking at a situation where China just isn't releasing as much information. They're not as chatty. You can't easily speak with even government officials in the way that you could before. In a way, I think the US government and politicians here in Washington are very often driving the debate about what's happening with China. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I mean, I think I'd echo a lot of the same comments, except that I've not been expelled. At least, haven't received that news. But early on, looking at this approximately 2 decades ago, slightly longer, right? There were a lot of efforts to travel to China to interface with those. And as was mentioned, I look at this through a largely China-Latin America lens. So I have the luxury of not only trying to understand what's happening in China and Chinese views on Latin America, Chinese policy for Latin America, but also traveling throughout the region to understand how China's engagement is manifesting and has evolved over time. I'm still able to do that, right? And so have, a lot of access in that respect. But what is missing largely is that ability to engage as extensively as I had in the past with the network of scholars, of others, those that were shaping policy in different directions and in different forms, that really provide critical insight on China's views on Latin America, on the direction of certain policy, the effectiveness of certain strategies, perceptions on the China-Venezuela relationship, for instance, which have soured considerably in recent years, and understanding that directly from the observations of those that I had established relationships with there in China was invaluable. So it's changed really dramatically in that way. I think another thing I would mention is that the relationship itself has evolved considerably over, unsurprisingly, right, over the course of 2-3 decades now, really since this period of enhanced engagement that started in the 1990s in Latin American context. And, as it matures, it becomes more complex. I mean, what used to be a focus on mostly high-level bilateral engagement is now a focus on, extensive subnational engagement. What used to be a focus on massive infrastructure project development, right, sort of emblematic of the Belt and Road Initiative around 2015, 2016, is now largely a focus on much smaller projects, right, with shorter overall timelines, smaller budgets, that are prolific at this juncture, right, but are very hard to track and are often, again, taking place at the local level. And then at the same time, we have seen, I would say, over the past 6, 7, 8 years, a massive increase in the amount of people-to-people engagement between China and wide-ranging different Latin American actors, right, that also has really critical implications. And so the complexity inherent in this new phase in the relationship makes it that much more difficult to track, right? Even if you do have access to Latin America, and even if you do have, the ability to travel across the region and do the kind of research that you might want to do. And so, what that means, and I'm sure we'll get into this, so I won't say much more about it, but that means that it will be critical for those of us here that are tracking these things, for those of us in China that are tracking everyone, right, to build networks that include those that are on the ground and monitoring these things in a real-time way, right, that are really fully plugged in and understand these developments and their wide-ranging implications, whether from an environmental, social, economic, right, perspective. And there are some major impediments and challenges and obstacles that we need to be overcome, and I'm happy to address them in the session.
So thanks, I'm very excited to reiterate a lot of the comments that were made in the first panel. These two speakers, I can say for myself in 2020, so 5 years ago, I was finishing a book about statistics in China and the role of numbers and the manipulation of numbers as a key piece of governance inside of China. And that project, one of the nice things about being academic is the extent to which you get to choose your own projects and kind of where you want to go next. And so in part, because of the intangible nature of that project, I was very interested in working on something very material and tangible, but it also, because of COVID and the closing, the kind of increased difficulty of doing fieldwork in China, thinking about something that I could study using the GIS or satellite techniques that were talked about at the end of the last panel, kind of that are in material statistics or trade statistics that are verifiable from outdoor or from external sources. So I've moved towards thinking more about climate change and China's intersection with the problem of global climate change, decarbonization. And part of that is because of interest and its importance. And wouldn't change it for anything in the world, but it did have this strategic piece that it is easier to study because it talk to people on the ground and they're not necessarily aware where their power is coming from. Like what is the generation mix in Shanghai at 12 o'clock in the afternoon? It's not an interview-based topic as much as others are. And so I think the strategic choice of a topic that can be analyzed in a world where it's harder to fly to China, it's harder to be in China, interviews in China are less forthcoming than they used to be. And then even the data itself, there's just less data released than there was previously. So I think from an academic's perspective, trying to be strategic in the questions that we try to ask and that we can answer well is something that I've thought about over the past 5 years. Well, thanks everyone for having me. I apologize if I'm looking at my phone. I've got a story that's on the runway that may go out at some point during this panel. So, look, I echo everything that's been said, beforehand. I'm in a slightly different position that I was never based in China. I was based in Asia. I was based in Hong Kong for the Financial Times at the time, was editing China, coverage from there. But I've been looking at kind of how China is interacting with the rest of the world in one way or another for most of the last 10, 15 years. And the big change for me, besides not being able to go to China a couple times a year, which was invaluable because China really does look different up close than it does in the kind of sometimes the cartoon pictures that are of it, or the stereotypes. But it's also just being able to engage and have frank conversations with Chinese economists, with Chinese officials outside of China. Everyone's just gotten a lot more shy, right? And everyone's just gotten much more cautious in sharing frank views and in being quoted, right? And we as journalists like to be, we're just vehicles for other people's opinions and analysis in a lot of ways. And it's harder to get that kind of frank analysis. I keep wondering if we're, I think of the China that I interacted with when I was based in Indonesia in the early 2000s, and that was the kind of China going shyly out into the world. It was the time when there was a colleague James King wrote a very good book in 2006 about China Shakes the World, and at the time it opens with this amazing scene of manhole covers disappearing around the world. And it was a story of China's appetites to shake the global economy as a result. And in Indonesia, I saw covered the Indian Ocean tsunami in late 2004 and 2005, and I remember watching this kind of aid mission of Chinese. I think they were PLA or they were kind of emergency response, setting up camp at the airport in Banda Aceh, right next to this field hospital that had been set up by USAID. And there was one country that was very good and had a lot of practice at kind of responding to emergencies in the US, and you could see them kind of racing to get involved. And then you can see China, this Chinese group of a few dozen people kind of setting up this very neat camp at the airport and then just waiting to see where they were needed, right? And then on day one, it was like they didn't leave the perimeter around their tents. And then on day two, they kind of moved a little bit closer. By day three, they were working with the US in the field hospital in some ways and kind of helping just because everyone was needed on the ground. And now I feel like we have this completely different China. It's just much more confident in going out into the world, and yet is very cautious. You might even say sometimes thin-skinned in its engagement with the rest of the world, and protects its image incredibly carefully, and that really hits us on a day-to-day basis when we're trying to engage, just have frank conversations, just to understand what's going on.
I wanted to just go more deep into some of the research topics that each of you work on. And I want to start off with Jeremy. I had a thought in my head when you were talking about how scholars have the freedom to a certain extent choosing their research topics, and how you veered from studying statistics to studying change in environmental policy, because it reminded me of something that a professor told me at grad school, where he was saying Benedict Anderson chose to did Imagine Communities, sort of seminal book, because he was banned from doing research in Indonesia. So he could no longer do Indonesia-specific research, and decided to write this book up with vast transnational theories instead. So like that can really change the scholarship. But you are still able to go to China. You went to China this past summer. And so I want to ask you two questions related to your research. One is, what did it feel like to be on the ground so recently in China? And how is that shaping the research you're doing, having that access? And two, in terms of how we think about Chinese environmental policy. I was just thinking that it's often discussed in this duality where China is either, the savior of humanity because it is innovating green technology and pushing it out in the world, or it will lead to the planet's destruction because it's still the greatest greenhouse gas emitter and is still invested in coal. So I was just wondering, there's this duality in the discourse. So I was just wondering how, as a researcher, you make sense of that through your on the field, on the ground research.
That's great. So I was based in Shanghai this summer for about a month. I did take a side trip to Ordos in Inner Mongolia, which for me was this great location that is a microcosm of China's kind of political economy. It is if you know about Ordos, it's probably because of the Ghost City reporting about it now 18 years ago, where there was empty buildings and row after row of apartment buildings and empty plazas. But it also it's a coal town. The Ghost City was built on coal mining profits. And so, but it now is also, it's the Western China where there's lots of space, there's lots of wind, and there's lots of sun, and you have huge renewable energy megabases. So being able to go and actually see, one, that the Ghost City is not full, but not empty, is like kind of something that you can read in statistics, but you can actually feel it in person, that the buildings are not unoccupied in the way that they were. But to know that there's 30,000 people that are under the ground at any one time in Ordos kind of mining coal, but there's also gigawatts of solar happening at the same time. There's just nothing that can really, even if you know those statistics, you can read the corporate reports that suggest this is happening, actually go and see the realities of them, and to talk to the people who are doing that work for this was really invaluable. On the broader narrative, it is this kind of from villain to hero or potential hero narrative that I think is really fascinating and has a lot of truth in it. So for instance, last week, Xi Jinping announced China's updated commitment to the Paris Agreement, its NDC. And a lot of the coverage of that of the new commitments, the update was quite positive. It was tepid, but positive. And in part, that's because of the United States. The United States, because Trump has again pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and kind of is talking about beautiful clean coal. China's relatively unambitious targets, emissions reduction targets by 2035 of 7 to 10% reductions it was seen as the adult in the room. This is serious, someone taking decarbonization seriously in a world that isn't. But I think something that I think is really important for China scholars and journalists to think about is not just to think about China as a funhouse mirror of the United States or as competitor to the United States, but take China on its own terms. I think one of the hardest things that I found, not in research terms, but in writing terms, what editors want is to write about China as China. And that kind of with its nuance and complexity, and to dive into different places and different stories that don't all fit together in a neat way, or that is dangerous or something else. And so I think that's, when I think about where kind of like my frustrations with the NDC and the weakness of the fact that it's been accepted as this positive development, when I think it really reflects a real political economy weakness of the state, is to me one of the things that I think is my sense of trying to right size and kind of right shape China.
Margaret, right now the discourse in DC around China and Latin America is oftentimes about US-China competition. And it's not just Latin America, it's also, how we frame Africa, usually like US policy and China policy on Africa as well as Southeast Asia. So I'm just wondering how you, in your research, how you try and go deeper. And when you talk with, policymakers here in Washington, how do you try and impress on them a more nuanced look at Latin America, not just viewing through the lens of China? And I do feel that there's an underscoring now in this administration of that rivalry because of their focus on the Western Hemisphere and what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question, and I would go so far as to say that it's not just a focus on looking at the stability of US-China competition, but also really focusing on specifically and almost exclusively on those developments in Latin America, China-Latin American context that have potential national security implications for the United States in the event of a potential conflict, right, between the US and China. So when you look at the reporting, I mean, this includes on, journalistic and academic, we're looking at case studies in particular. So much of the focus is on those projects that are deemed to or viewed to have a potential dual use capacity, right, civilian military capacity. So we've heard a lot about Shanghai, the Shanghai port, right, which is a massive port. China has majority ownership and control in many forms of that port in Peru. And it is deemed to be, or considered to be, broadly speaking, among the policy community here in the US, something that could be leveraged to China's benefit in the event of a future conflict. The other areas of focus tend to be other sort of, primarily maritime transport infrastructure, such as the Panama Canal, but other canal related and infrastructure projects that are also of concern for the same reasons. Surveillance capabilities, right, whether they be space related or at the local level, but that would again introduce vulnerabilities for the US military or others in the event of a conflict. And so this is, my concern is that not just that this is being viewed right through a primarily US-China lens, but that it's only part of the story, right? If you're talking about US-China competition, it goes further than that. Where so much of what's happening, right, is in the digital space. It's in massive investment across what China has called new infrastructure, right? These innovation-related industries, and we're seeing extensive growth in those areas. I wouldn't call it dominance, right, across the board, but certainly a very competitive position for Chinese companies across countries and across sectors. And so, that story in many cases is not one that we're hearing about in much depth. And so, I think what I try to impress upon those who are thinking about this in a strategic, from a strategic dimension here in Washington, is that the story is bigger, and not just that it's bigger, but it's ever evolving, right? It's continuously evolving. There are all kinds of actors and factors that are shaping this, right? Both in China, if we think about Chinese policy and the challenges that China is facing and the implications of the policy making that China is introducing. The US has a role to play in this too, as we know, and we've seen some efforts, and we'll likely see more efforts, right, to engage in this space in an effort to shape outcomes. But also important to this is the Latin America story, and that's one that tends to be left out, I think, almost entirely, right? This is a co-produced relationship, right? China, of course, has interests, right? It has some policies that are governing the ways in which Chinese companies are engaging in different sectors across the region and the mechanisms through which they do that. But so many of the outcomes are driven by Latin American actors, and in ways that many may not anticipate, right? Things can go completely sideways for a lot of different reasons, to be they political in nature because of the reactions of NGOs and the effectiveness of their efforts in derailing certain projects, because projects fall out of favor, things go terribly wrong in the construction process. Really, you name it. And so that story too is one that's really missing, and one that needs to be understood, and that I try to press on my students, but also, when making or having these conversations with policy level.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Margaret. So can you give us an example of one or two examples of like a thing that we're missing in Latin America, or that's missing from the discourse right now on the China-Latin America relationship? If you have a specific country or specific type of interaction country to tell us about, that'd be great.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there are a few things that we need to, perhaps there are some assumptions, right, that are being made. And I don't know, that the story is always missing, but sometimes the assumptions are taken for granted, right? Or they are, at least in the policymaking space, one comes across, some of the same narratives over and over, even though, as I mentioned, this is an evolving dynamic, right? And things may be changing in the moment, more or less. One is, what China wants out of this relationship, and that certainly is something that has changed over time. There's a degree of continuity, there's resource seeking activity, market seeking activity, an effort to make Chinese companies, competitive across domains and across sectors. But beyond that, now we see a wide-ranging new policies being implemented in China that have implications for Latin America and the way in which companies will engage or not engage, as the case may be. And in the past year or two, Latin America has been somewhat deprioritized, at least from an investment perspective and in comparison to other regions. Another, I think, really important question that we need to ask is the extent to which the US itself and its interest in competing with the US is driving what China is doing in the region, right? There's an assumption, I think, here in Washington, that this is a big part of the equation. It may be in certain instances, in certain countries, and in certain, certain types of engagement, but it's perhaps not the driving factor, right, for so much of what is happening across the global South and indeed in the Latin American context. Another, I think, critical story that we need to cover is this question of an understanding more depth and are these questions of lessons learned, right? How is China evolving based on what it's learned about what it should do and not do, right, in pursuit of certain objectives, be they commercial or political in nature or otherwise, and about shifting perceptions in Latin America of what it is to work with China, how best to achieve certain objectives. Certainly, the Ecuador of Rafael Correa is not the Ecuador of today, and the way in which Ecuador is engaging with China is very different based on the experiences had about 10 years ago. And the same can be said, I think, in other countries where they're beginning to see the effects of recent policy decisions in China, economic policy decisions, and in some cases are describing what they're feeling as an inundación, right, as a flooding or of activity. So some don't go so far as to call it dumping, but a lot of this excess capacity, right, the effects of Chinese policy are being felt in the global South and in specific countries in particular in ways that are very worrisome and may very well change the nature, dynamic, tenor of these relationships in the years to come. So, I mean, it's not as though we're not getting it right necessarily, or but it's a lot of these stories just aren't being explored or told, I think, in enough depth to demonstrate the extent, the dimension, right, and the depth of this relationship and how it is indeed one that is ever evolving.
And Jim, you talked about how your exposure from China then led you to have to report on China from the outside. And you said very specifically that a lot of the conversation, at least in the US, is now dominated by what policymakers say here in Washington. And so I think for both of our newspapers, a lot of the stories that we end up doing are framed through that discourse. How do you grapple with that, having been someone who's recently reporting China? And then when you choose stories or when you approach stories here based in the US, how do you try and navigate around or into the conversation of US-China policy?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. As the story is so much a G2 issue, whether it's in Latin America. I mean, I think that what Margaret's saying is exactly right, that we're not really listening to, why Peru might want to have the Shanghai port in the same way that we're thinking about it in the dimension of US-China relations. And the US government, it clearly, it's always the question is what is the administration's China strategy? And it's never really very clear, right? It's almost a full-time job is trying to figure out what the administration's China policy is. And that's everyone, that's each administration. And but we have voices in China, the creation of the Select Committee on China, for instance, it's supposed to be a clearinghouse for ideas on China. And I'm not sure that every voice in Washington is super informed about China. I think that many politicians are proudly, proud to say, I've never been to China and I never will go to China. And one of the arguments that they would make is, I could be an expert on Iran and North Korea and never go to those countries. I think that's missing a lot of the story. In terms of trying to understand, trying to interpret what a policy might be from Washington and try to understand who the players are and why they'd be saying certain things, that's an ongoing job. One of my British newspaper friends would always say that their question is always, why is this liar lying to me? And that's sort of the starting point for reporting, which I think is a sort of good rule to, sort of keep in the back of your mind. As I'm not in China and dealing much more with Washington, there's so many fascinating ideas that are coming out of this city in terms of expertise. And some of those are from politicians, a lot of them are from think tanks, but I don't know, you almost have to pick your battles. What is it that I'm going to focus on? And then you just try to talk to lots of people and try to build a certain story. But I'm going to agree with Margaret again. I think it very often just becomes this, what is the rivalry between the US and China and how this issue or that issue is seen through that rivalry. But the business is incredibly complex. I mean, how many people were reporting about NVIDIA 5 years ago, or could even spell it or knew what it was? It's so technical, whether you're dealing with China from the automotive sector or the human rights or technology like NVIDIA. It's so technical that I think you have to look more and more, not for the noise, not for the flashy lights or the great quote, that you really have to dig a little bit harder to try to understand what's the complexity here.
I want to follow up and ask you a structural question about the newsroom, because I know that, when reporters from the Journal were expelled from China, then you created these satellite newsrooms around the world, and also because people were rotating out of China. So I know in Washington you had a team of China specialists and that team has ended now. And then you're in New York, and there's also a team of China specialists in New York. So do you all divide up your beats so that, for example, someone from your team is supposed to focus on China's interaction with the US, and you have more latitude, for example, to choose different topics on reporting on China out in the world? Or how does it work beat by beat, and especially following the elimination of the Washington team? And now it's just the New York team, I think.
The sausage making is never very pretty.
But as a journalist, I know the structure is very important for what stories end up getting reported. So that's why I asked you that question.
It's really story by story, and we're figuring it out all the time. We've had many management changes at the Wall Street Journal and structural changes. I think that increasingly they're trying to put more of the power for the story in Singapore, which is becoming our base. We have fewer people in Hong Kong. We still have people in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore. And we have a few people. We have 3 foreigners in China itself, mainland China, in Beijing. We do work collaboratively. So there's a certain amount of freelancing, but it's in many ways, it's both top down and bottom up in terms of the way we report. We don't have one particular system in terms of how we break it up, but we try to be involved in stories that are going to be touching on China, and that's increasingly everything. And I think that and that doesn't always work out. Sometimes it's news to the bureau chief in Beijing that somebody's writing something about China. We do have a team in New York, Ling Wei and me, and we work together, but we sort of work separately. I mean, we're not a great answer because each topic is different, but we are trying to centralize it more from Singapore.
Great, thanks. And Sean, has your story published yet?
Just went out.
Okay, I'm wondering if our editors will call, like Jim's editor, my editor will call us to on the story. But
I hope so.
Right. So your entire beat is right now firmly immersed in US-China relations because we're reporting on terrorists, we're reporting on the trade relationship, which is for President Trump, the central aspect of the US-China relationship. So how do you approach that beat? And it's very different than in the Biden administration. How has the change in administrations changed the way you approach reporting on US-China?
Yeah, and it's very different from the first Trump administration as well, which I think is an important point as well. Look, I don't know that there is a China strategy right now. I think and trying to figure out what it is and who is driving it is one of the key questions. The story we just published is that the Chinese, going into the Madrid talks, offered a big surge of Chinese investment into the US economy in return for a lifting of curbs or loosening of curbs on inbound Chinese investment. We don't know yet if President Trump would accept that, but we're talking probably about trillions of dollars in terms of the size of the offer. And we know that President Trump, and this is a change from his first term, has really made inbound investment and attracting inbound investment a pillar. He's talked about $17 trillion in investment coming into the United States, which is, if you know the size of the US economy, it's about $29-30 trillion economy. Seems improbable, at least in a short period. But we are in this world right now where, as we were discussing this story, where it's like, well, this is a complete red line. The last 10 years, the policy in the United States has been to restrain Chinese investment, to harden up the CFIUS constraints. As recently as February, the Trump administration was putting out an America First investment policy document in which they were talking about China as a strategic rival and really taking a hard line towards any Chinese investment in the United States and applying greater scrutiny of it. Well, the guy who wrote that memo has since left the administration, was turfed out. And we are in this world now where all of a sudden the administration is okay with selling NVIDIA chips to Beijing, where we seem to have a changing cast of the advisors around President Trump, and we have a transactional president, and a moment when that might be possible. So I think this is, to me, the central challenge is like figuring out what might he actually go for, right? And what might what might President Trump actually sign off on? And then how might that shape the broader US-China policy? Might we see a return to a much more commercially driven economic relationship rather than one where national security is the overwhelming force in the room? Might there be some kind of rupture between the White House and Congress over this? Might the Select Committee lose influence over China policy? Might someone like Jensen Huang be, in fact, the most important advisor to the president when it comes to China policy? And then we're also seeing, I think, and this gets into what Margaret was talking about, the kind of narrative about, the easy narrative about a G2 and this competition and so on. We're seeing a changing relationship in Europe. Just what is happening with electric vehicles in Europe is fascinating, right? They have put up tariffs on the one hand against Chinese vehicles, and at the same time, they're welcoming, cautiously, but welcoming the building of Chinese EV factories in Europe. BYD is now looking at its third site in Europe, which is remarkable. And I remember sitting down with the Spanish economy minister last year at one point, and him pointing out that they had a former Peugeot plant I believe it was a Peugeot plant in Spain that had been bought by a Chinese EV company. He said, what do I do? I get the whole point of putting up a barrier to EVs. I get that they might be, really tough competition for a European auto industry, but they're creating jobs in a place that needs jobs right now. And I think that is the kind of where the narrative is going to turn. And we'll see what happens.
We've seen Chinese investment in the US before. There's that famous documentary, American Factory, about Fuyao glass, and some of us have probably I've been to that plant outside of Dayton, and it's still there, and we'll see what happens with places like that. But it's not a static relationship, right? The narrative isn't here, and it's not stuck. It's going to change, and it's going to evolve, and it might surprise us.
Thanks, John. I want to start asking audience questions, but I just want to note something about the narratives and how we need to move past certain narratives. I was here at a Hopkins event just a couple nights ago where a filmmaker I knew from who had been based in Beijing and another filmmaker were presenting a film called Made in Ethiopia about China. And it was about looking at a factory similar to the one in the Midwest that you just mentioned about the Chinese factory in Ethiopia. And one of the people on the panel after the film was saying that in Washington, we always talk about US-China competition in Africa, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation with Margaret on Latin America. But he was noting, this is a former US diplomat, he was noting that America just isn't present economically in Ethiopia. It's really dumb that we talk about this competition in Africa when the US isn't even there competing on a commercial level in Ethiopia. So it's like a fabricated conversation that we're having here in America. And I think a lot of the issues you talked about, Sean, about fact that China is putting investment in other countries with BYD and other vehicles is the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely vital. I think we've gone from a world in which, and this is, taking the longer arc of history, post-World War II world, in which the US was the power that was going out there and creating jobs and opportunity in a lot of other parts of the world, whether it's in the Marshall Plan or moving to Latin America. I think of something like Citibank, right? There were city bankers all over the world of different nationalities. They had subsidiaries all over. I think of GE. I think of all these big American companies that were going out into the world and setting up operations and so on. And that just doesn't happen very much anymore. The US, and this started in the first Trump administration, the second Biden administration, we saw it also with IRA, where it was sucking in investment. Right? And it's still, I think, a net exporter of FDI, but it's not the same presence that it once was. And in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, China has all of a sudden become this big source of outbound investment into places like Ethiopia, and so on. And a lot of it was through Belt and Road, right? And there was huge suspicion here in Washington about that. There were lots of questions about how it was done and who actually got the jobs and the exporting of Chinese labor into a lot of these places. But for a lot of other countries in the world, China has been a job creator. And the US has kind of been this lecturer for a while, and now is kind of pulling back and saying, actually, we want you to invest in us instead.
I think some of the conversation around Belt and Road in the first term administration shows how some journalists and others, including at my paper, got the narrative wrong because they focused a lot on what Washington was emphasizing, which is this debt trap diplomacy. And it turns out a lot of the projects aren't actually a form of debt trap diplomacy. I think that was a big, misfire on the way that both U.S. policymakers and journalists and maybe some scholars are interpreting the outcome of Belt and Road projects. So I think we've seen the discourse on that. Because the reality is not what people were saying the first time.
Yeah, although to be clear, a lot of the structure of a lot of the financing that China put out as part of the Belt and Road was pretty tough. I mean, using accounts that kind of capture export revenues in order to pay to pay off loans. I mean, Aid Data has just done some fantastic work detailing just the structure of the financing. And so on, but you can't, and you can look at countries like Zambia and Ghana and so on, and there clearly is a debt issue there, and China plays a big part in that. But yeah, it's not as simple as purely about that.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm thinking of is that a lot of the framework, especially it was being pushed by some officials in the first Trump administration, was that there's a centralized effort to get countries into debt so that then they would be able to turn commercial ports into military ports for the PLA, things like that. So anyways, let's go to questions now in the audience. The woman in the green there.
My name is Tara McKelvey. I used to be with BBC and with Radio Free Asia. And I'm wondering if you can tell me about how you see the Ministry of State Security or the Chinese intelligence services. Obviously, they can't be here, but they have assets, sort of. And I'm wondering what your impressions are both of the services themselves and how it affects your life, if it does.
Internal security is Jim.
I mean, this is a really rich source of stories in the United States. I mean, it's something that I've spent a lot of time on. I was just talking with somebody last night, and we were talking about United Front. If you start to think about how United Front operations work around the world, it can very quickly sound like you're talking like conspiracy theory. You know, that they're everywhere, but they're nowhere. You know, do they exist? Do they not exist? And I think that it is a dimension of China that really demands a lot of coverage. And we look at that in transnational repression. I was just walking around in New York City the other day, and there was a giant piece of art, not exactly my taste, but it was quite interesting, which was the subject of a major operation by United Front people in China to go after this China-born artist. I think he was based in California. He made this giant head of Xi Jinping with all of these corona spikes in it. And these people who were affiliated with Beijing went and destroyed it in the California desert. And I think that people went to prison over it because they were unregistered agents of the Chinese government. So it's a real thing, and we cover it quite a bit.
In the front here with the glasses.
Hi, this is Wendy, a postdoc from University of Virginia. So I have two questions. One for the journalists here, like Jeremy and Sean. So do you see your role as a journalist from a professional outlet shifting over the years? I'm asking because, as you know, a lot of audiences, they consume China stories from ordinary social media users. There were a lot of like TikTok explainers out there explaining what's going on about Chinese internet culture, what's the daily life here in China, and something like that. Do you sense a bit of like competition, or how do you see your advantage still as a professional outlets like journalists? And then second question, I will be quick. For Margaret and Jeremy at the same time, because I teach Chinese media class at the institution, so I know like teaching China class is quite challenging these days because it causes a lot of tension and also disputes. There's one group of students probably have strong opinion about China, and there's another group of students not knowing China much yet. So I don't know, like probably a lot of us can relate to my situation here. So how do you see the do's and don'ts when you teach Chinese classes in the classrooms? What's your advice and best practices?
You want to start with the journalism?
Yeah, I have a 20-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, and if I was to pop on TikTok, I would probably get excoriated at home. And so I think there's and you know, and there is some there's always, I think, some pressure in the newsroom to do social media stuff in videos and so on. I consume less social media than I did a few years ago. It's healthy. I also really appreciate sometimes the surprising depth of the conversation on social media about stuff. I know I was kind of tossing away TikTok videos and so on, but there's a level of communication that's happening there that isn't just cute cats. And so I think my job, and is to kind of start a conversation. And to kind of introduce new facts. I mean, my kind of AI strategy is, and the way to kind of keep my job and in an AI world is to do things that AI can't. And so AI is very good at aggregating existing information. But if I can throw new information into the mix, at least for a few seconds of the day, I'm gonna have relevance to the conversation, right? And then the conversation kind of goes from there. So but I really admire colleagues who are very good at tapping into the memes and doing social media. I've got a great face for radio and probably a constitution for print.
See something about those videos. I think that it's partly just the way social media is developing, but another part of it is I think the Chinese government runs a very, very sophisticated media program. And it is tapping into influencers who basically just say positive things about China. And some of the things that they point out are really, really fascinating. The subway that goes through the buildings in Chongqing and things like that. And I think it is with fewer Western reporters in China, they're getting fewer of those kind of stories because we are just focused too much on, we're not focused too much, we're focused a lot on the great power relationship. When if we had more people, if we had back to the whatever 15 or so people that we had Westerners in Beijing and Shanghai, we would be doing these kind of stories, but I think we'd be doing it in a more balanced way than this is just rah about China and asking questions about that. I think it's a new dimension, but I think we really have to see the hand of the Chinese government, the Chinese state in the media there.
On the education question of teaching, I'm teaching a class this semester, Chinese politics and climate change. And that class is great because it has students that really care and are very knowledgeable about climate change and know nothing about China. And there are students that know a lot about China and don't know a lot about climate change. And so it's tough in the sense that I have to try to bring up to speed the class in different ways and then kind of like integrate these discussions. So it's not just about climate change broadly, but about Chinese kind of decarbonization and the politics and political economy there. So my advice, such as it is to try to think about, right, China classes, if it's just China, that's hard. If you have like a set of students who are Chinese and a set of students who are not, or who have a deep background and those who don't. On the other hand, I will say that when I have taught these kind of big intro to China classes, I've had Chinese students come up to me and say things that they are learning about China that they didn't know themselves. And I guess I can thank the propaganda apparatus for allowing my work and my kind of lectures to have some utility even for those who grew up in the country.
I mean, I won't add too much more to that. I have, similar challenges. And then also, of course, teaching about China, Latin America, you have those that are Latin Americanists, right? You have those that come with a China background, some that have a little bit of both, right? And then some that are more focused on different functional domains, right? And are interested in understanding how those apply in this particular relationship. So it's really a mixed group, which is it's a blessing in many ways, right? You have all of these strengths, and so it really contributes to the discussion. Everyone can bring something to bear, and so the idea is to get, at least at the beginning of every semester, I try to do a little bit of a who's who mapping, right? Just to get a sense of who are we talking about on all of these sides, and what is it really? I mean, who are the institutions? It's a little bit 101 for some folks, right? But all tolerate it because they get a little bit out of that exercise. And then inevitably over the course of the semester, there are conversations about Chinese statistics, the reliability of the statistics, what it means to, do real data work, what you have to do, getting into the trenches on that, right? And we even do some exploration of some of the work that I've done in other institutions, trying to pull together this data and have it for the first time. And then also, how do you read? I mean, this comes up every semester too. How do you read? How should I interpret these policy documents? What is the terminology that's being used? Is there value in looking at these things over time? What different methods can be used to really glean as much, right, from all of these different documents as possible, and incorporating those in the syllabus, as well as other, foreign language materials that can be utilized by the different students in the class with different strengths.
And the second relative? Right behind you, yeah. Right third row.
Thank you for this. My name is Nayan. I'm a journalist as well as a policy research analyst. So I'm a contractor with the Rhodium Group right now. I have a couple of questions. One about, I think, Edward, you mentioned about the narrative piece of it. I'm just thinking in terms of the coverage that comes out of the West these days, or even the last few years, maybe a decade, from China. Is more about, even when you look at clean energy sector, where China has clear leadership, but the coverage is sometimes focused more on the problems with that, the problems of overcapacity, or the problems of China choking other countries of those technologies. So my question is, how much influence, of course there is an influence of national security concerns of the US on Chinese policies, how much of that is reflected in the reporting right now, and what can be done to make it more objective in our writings? Second question, just about, very quick question about the popular myths about China. You already mentioned about the debt trap diplomacy. I just maybe want to know from the speaker about more, like, do you have a list? I do have my list, but I don't want to share. So I don't want to follow your opinion, but do you have a list of popular myths that have currency even now when we talk about China? Thank you.
I have my own thoughts on this, your question on national security concerns, but I want to hear from Sean and Jim about, since they obviously grapple with this question coverage.
I was gonna let you go first, but
I was thinking about what I was gonna tell my editors about your story.
I'll tell my editors that you said that. Look, I think popular myths, whether we're too negative, are just a professional issue across journalism, whether it's dealing with China or not. I think of the American Rust Belt, right? I also have another story up today about which is a kind of weekend essay that we do on thinking about Pittsburgh, right? And thinking about the kind of eds and meds model there. And this weird clash that we have, or that the Trump administration is framing between universities and kind of industrial America. And actually they're much closer related, and the future of industry is being born in universities and so on. So I think that's one example here in New York. I also, it drives me nuts whenever someone says the economy is great or the economy stinks, because it all depends on where you're sitting, right? And the US economy is yes, there's this, the macro economy, but it's many different economies. I think the economist Marcus Andy pointed out recently that probably a dozen US states are in a technical recession right now. And so you need to think about that. Depends where you are on the income ladder, right? The top 10% of consumers in the United States are now responsible for 50% of the consumption. It might even be 90% of consumption. I might have that number wrong. But the point is that the bottom 10% of by income aren't doing so great. And so it's this applies to China, it applies to the United States, it applies to Europe. I think the cartoon version of the French probably isn't very close to reality, et cetera, and so on. And I just think you have to constantly, as journalists, kind of just voice, do I really know this? Is this really what I see? Am I being objective here, and so on? And I don't think that's saying, on the one hand, here are the negatives, and on the other hand, here are the positives. I don't think that's always being negative, being objective. I think there's a kind of a balancing that you have to do, and so on. So that's a really long way of me avoiding your question.
Do we frame China stories too much in terms of national security, US national security concerns?
Well, I think that when it comes to a lot of, so-called myths about the way China is operating, let's just say technology, I think two things can be true. I think that there can be a state-directed effort to try to control a particular technology, but I think there's also a pure profit, huge, profit motive based on, deep competition in China between companies trying to build the best possible product. I mean, I think it's as simple and complex as that both can be true.
If I can jump on that point, I do think the idea that there are narratives that is an important idea, but it's also important to remember that there are facts that are separate from those narratives or that exist outside of them, and that narratives can shift. And so I think that Sean's story is something that I've been trying to convince people in DC that need to be prepared. If you're interested in kind of developing EVs in the United States, what happens if there is a deal with Trump and China about kind of encouraging China's investment in the United States? Is there going to be local resistance to that? Is there going to be congressional resistance to that? Is there going to be labor resistance to I think thinking through these beyond the narratives that exist today or dominant today, to think through the possibilities and get outside of those narratives. I think it can be very hard, especially in this town, to get beyond anything narratives that dominate the day, to think about scenarios and possible realities. And I think that one thing about this administration and this president is that uncertainty is real and present always. And so having to think, I think it encourages and rewards those who are willing to think about what if, because there's a lot of you never know what is going to happen.
And then on his second question, and let me ask Margaret and Jeremy about this, like what are, he wants concrete examples of like a type of framework for China or narrative that has now, as dominant, still dominant now, but that that you might think is a myth. And so what are some examples of that?
I guess here I would say something like the idea of China Inc., the idea that China works as a kind of like universal actor that is kind of going about the world acting on its own interests, when in fact, as was just hinted at, right, Chinese firms are in cutthroat competition, like destroying each other on a day-to-day basis, and BYD investing in Brazil is very different than the various other like kind of like EV, like neo investors. It's like they're trying to kill each other, these firms, and they're fighting. And so the idea that this is all in China's interest as opposed to interesting actors inside of a country of 1.4 billion people kind of pursuing their own self-interest inside of a political system that has particular rewards and constraints. It's a much more complicated story than China Inc. And we need to worry about what China is doing. I think breaking that kind of singular piece is for me the biggest myth and dominant frame.
Yeah, I mean, and then I would add, that's a terrific one. It's one that I've thought about a lot too. China Inc. also kind of grand strategy, the idea that Xi Jinping is sitting there making every single decision about every investment that's being made across the Latin American region or wherever, right? Which one is it's one that's pervasive, and it's certainly here, reference to in the Latin American context as well. Debt trap, as we've already talked about, right? That's one, and especially in Latin America, since we haven't really seen finance there. And large scale loans, right? Sovereign lending there since around 2015, 2016 in any real way. Certainly not the 40 billion that we saw in 2010, for instance. The other one, this is not about China necessarily, but it's one that you hear in Latin America, which I think is, or the US perpetuates, right, about its relationship with Latin America vis-a-vis China. And it's that the US, and I don't know how often I hear this, probably on a monthly basis, that, if only we were there and only we were doing things, that we would be the preferred partner. And that may be very well be true, right? If there's a US offer, if there's an infusion of capital, if there's something of a coordinated strategy, right, that could be proposed, whether at the bilateral level or hemispherically, that would be preferred to anything China has to offer. But I think we need to think a little bit more in depth about that, and especially because there are different things that China offers, right? And a lot of this that the US is not capable at this particular juncture of providing, whether it develops a strategy or not. And so really thinking through that particular assumption would be really, I think, quite valuable.
So I have good news and bad news. The good news is that lunch is here. I see in the back. The bad news is we're out of time for further insights from our panelists. One thing that Margaret's last comment on grand strategy brought to mind is I can't count the number of times I've been at parties or discussions in Washington where someone will come up to me and they'll say, and we'll be talking about US-China policy usually. And usually it's someone who is somewhat critical of the US approach to China, whether it's in a Democratic administration or Republican administration. He'll say, well, the Chinese always think of things in terms of decades or centuries, and we're very short-sighted. And it's like one of the biggest myths, I think, about policymaking in China. There are many myths out there. And that's like it's generally people use that in a positive manner about China. But anyways, thank you to everyone on this panel for your insights. And thank you to Sean for giving us previews of your stories. And thanks for the great questions. And we can have more discussion of all this over lunch. Thank you.